Hey everyone, this is Scott again with a new Ember tutorial. So gonna continue off of some of the work that I had done with my last tutorial. If you had watched it, I just showed how to set up a really basic JSON API. I used Elixir Phoenix, and we're gonna use that API in this example today, but it's really not so strict that you have to use the same exact API that I'm using, because we're gonna cover OAuth2. Specifically, we're going to handle it with Google, but just know that the OAuth2 flow is going to be the very similar no matter what provider you're going with, whether that's Facebook, GitHub, Twitter. But I'm going to use Google for this example because it's kind of what I've worked with before. And the reason we have to have an API running is because this is a full stack problem, and we do need a way to share secrets from our API to authenticate with Google, and you typically just don't want to do that in the front end. You don't want to pass secrets through your parameters because then users could see it, and you don't want the secrets for your Google application to get out. So I'm working off a pretty simple example. Let me run this app locally real quick. The API in question you can find at this repository. I'll link that in the description. If you don't have Phoenix installed, the steps are really easy. It's really easy to get this API running. Once you have Phoenix installed, pull down this repository. I'm working off of the google-auth branch. Make sure you install the dependencies if you haven't already, and then just run mix phx.server. So mix phoenix.server. So again, if you don't want to learn Phoenix, you can kind of just run this, and you don't really have to change that much. And just to show you, if we go to localhost 4000/projects, it's just really simple JSON API, just returning a bunch of JSON. And we're going to go over what we need to do with the backend in order to get the correct credentials. So this is my dummy Ember app. It's just reading stuff off of that API, off of localhost 4000. It reads the document model and just lists them all here. We're not really going to be dealing with this, but just kind of wanted a simple example. If you browse to /project/1, it'll retrieve a single record, the first project that we had. So if you watched that last video, you'll notice we're using the seeds that we had created before. And if you had question over the styling, I'm just using an add-on called Ember Paper. It uses Google's Materialize. So it just has a bunch of default CSS and components that we can use. So if you go and actually look at the templates here, you'll notice that they're pretty simple. I also don't have any CSS. And again, it's just kind of just to get something quick on the page. So let me go into this directory. Let me make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to create a new branch. And I will push this branch up at the end of the tutorial. So if you want to just pull it down and play around with it, you can. We'll just call this google-auth as well. Cool. And I think it might be best to kind of start with what the OAuth2 flow is. So the first step is we're going to create an app on Google through the Google Developer Console. I created a dummy Google account. So if you are following along, don't try to just copy and paste the credentials that I have in this tutorial, because I am going to delete them. But kind of just follow along step by step. The way the OAuth2 flow works, so when we create an app, Google is going to give us two things that we need. One is an API key, and the other is a client secret. So when we start the OAuth flow, our front end is going to make a request to Google. It's going to pass along the API key, which we got when we created our app. So we're going to pass that to Google. We're also going to pass along a scope. So the scope for Google's case tells it what application or what APIs we want to access. So if you want to access somebody's Google Drive to see their documents, there's a Google Drive scope. If you want to access their email, there's an email scope. User info, there's a user info scope. So we're going to pass across the scopes that we want. So when you log into an app and you select your account, and then another pop-up comes that says it wants to, are you willing to grant access to this application to do this, this, and this? That's where the scope comes from. So you do have to declare what it is that you want access to, and then they have to grant that access. So once they log in, you can't just go into their Google account and do whatever you want. They have to actually purposely grant you access to that. So we send that to Google. Google says, okay, I see that API key. That makes sense to me. I'm going to pass back an authorization code. So this is what Google sends back to us. It also sends back some additional info like the redirect URI. So we want to make sure that we're trying to redirect back to the right page. And I'll go over that in more detail. But we take that authorization code and we send it to our backend. The backend then takes that authorization code and it makes an additional request to Google with the client secret. So that, again, when we create an app, we get an API key and a secret. And the secret is what you want to keep, obviously, secret. That's why we have it in our backend. Because if it was on our front end, anybody could just intercept it and they could just inspect the network request or even just inspect the JavaScript, get the secret, and then suddenly they have access to your app. They can do a bunch of stuff, malicious stuff. So that's why we include it in the back end. You could absolutely do it in the front end if you wanted to. You will be able to get the correct auth information. Just don't publish that. You know, that shouldn't be a public web app. So anyway, we send this to our backend, which in our case is our Phoenix API, but it can be anything at all. That API is going to do something really simple. It's just going to take that auth code, and make a post request. So let me break this onto another line. It will make a post request back to Google with that secret. And then Google is going to send back, is going to essentially say, okay, cool, you have all the information. It looks correct. I trust you. The person granted access to this. And now I'm going to send you back the access token. So the access token, this is what we need to have on every single request that goes out to Google from that point on. So Google said, yes, here's this access token. It expires at some point, but this access token lets Google know who the user is, what they have access to, and we just have to pass that access token across in our headers. So when we get that access token, every API request that we make out to Google at that point needs to have what's called the bearer token. So there's going to be, we're going to have some headers. So if you've ever written AJAX requests, you know you can write custom headers. It's going to look like this: authorization, and it's going to be bearer. So it's a bearer token, and that's where we're going to have our access token. Access token. So we're going to send that across in every single request that we make out to Google. And that's how Google is going to know that, okay, yeah, I can send this information back to you. And that's what we'll use to retrieve the user's information, if that's what you want, drive information, again, anything that Google might host. So that's kind of OAuth in a nutshell. So yeah, there's a lot of steps. It can be really confusing when you first start out, but just know that it's there, you know, for security. You can even add more security to this if you want. We can go over that in more detail if people are interested in another tutorial. But for this sake, we're going to try to keep it somewhat simple. So if you are familiar with the Ember ecosystem, you probably are thinking, all right, there's got to be some sort of add-on that helps me do this stuff already. And there absolutely is. We're going to use an add-on called Ember Simple Auth. That's going to take care of of storing session information for us. It's also going to take care of adding this bearer access token authorization header to every request for us. And we're going to use another add-on called Torii. Torii has some preset authenticators for us specifically, has one for Google, so it knows where to make the request for us. We can pass additional options, and it just kind of takes care of some of the heavy lifting for us. But there still are going to be a lot of steps on our end, so kind of bear with me there. So the first thing we want to do is actually create our Google app. So we're going to create this here. We're going to give this a name, project manager. We'll call it test. And go ahead and create that. And now we need to create credentials for this. And we want to select OAuth client ID because that's what we are doing, OAuth authentication. Apparently we need to create a consent screen. So this is by Scott Batson test at Gmail. Product name, project manager test. Homepage URL, we'll just do localhost for now. We don't, or actually this is optional, so we don't need to do this quite yet. Privacy URL optional, terms of service is also optional. So let's just save that. This is going to be a web application. And now this is where we set up our app info. So authorized JavaScript origins. So where can we make requests from? So this will be localhost 4200. That's support that Ember runs on by default. And I'm also going to be making requests from my backend, my API, and that runs on localhost 4000. And then obviously you'll want to set this up if you're hosting on a domain with those actual domains. Authorized redirect URIs. The add-on that we're going to use is called Torii, and Torii actually comes with a redirect template by default. We don't have to use it, but for the sake of this, we're going to keep it simple. So it's going to be localhost 4200 is where our local app is running. Torii, which is the name of the add-on we're going to use, and it's redirect.html. And we just click create. And this is where our OAuth info comes from. So this is that API key that I was talking about, and this is the secret which we'll put in our back end when we try to get that access token. So at any time you can just click on this. One of the nice things too is you can just download a JSON blob which will have this info for you. Let me drag this over to my monitor here. So you'll see this is just a bunch of JSON with that client information that we might need. So I'm just going to leave this tab up here. Let's close this. We don't need to save that. Cool. So now our app has been created. So I'm going to go ahead and install those add-ons. Again, it's Ember Simple Auth. So go to embersimpleauth.com if you want to read through the documentation. And this is what we're going to do. So let me kill Ember here. And the other one is called Torii. So if you want to check it out on GitHub, I'll post this within the description of the video as well. And we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to do Ember install Torii once this is done setting up. So Ember install Torii. Cool. So let's go ahead and just run our app again. And we can step through setting all of this up. So make sure, just refresh and everything is working right. Cool. So let's start by going into our environment config. So this is the default one that just ships with Ember. I haven't made any changes to this yet. What we want to do is we want to add an environment variable called Torii. Now you don't have to set it up here. The nice thing with this, though, is if you are going to ship a production app that uses Google OAuth, you will most likely create a development app, one that your web developers will use while they're testing things, and then you'll use an actual production one. You might even have another environment, like a UAT environment for testing, in which case you're probably going to want to create an a Google app for each one. So that's why we configure it here, because then we can dynamically change this information based on what environment we're deploying to. Because you don't want to be hitting your production Google app when you're just kind of monkeying around locally. Since we're just monkeying around locally, we'll create it here and we won't override it, but just know you want to get in this habit. So we create the Torii variable. It starts out as just a hash, and here's where we define our providers, and that is also a hash within here. So you can have multiple providers within Torii. So you can actually have an app that OAuths with Google or Facebook or Twitter, GitHub. I'm sure you've seen lots of examples of that where you go to a website and you can log in with either Facebook or Google. So you would want to set up both of these providers here. We're just focusing on Google right now, and it is Google OAuth2. And the reason I know that is if you just go to the Torii's documentation, they'll list all the ones that they support. So the first thing that we need to set up is the API key, and that is this here. So I'm literally just going to copy and paste this. So that's that first piece of the puzzle. This is what we're going to send to Google, and then Google's going to send it back to us. We also have the redirect URI, which again was this here. So I'm going to copy and paste this. This is something that Torii sets up for us. So we did Ember install Torii. It handled the redirect page for us. Cool. And then we have a scope. So scope, again, is what Google public APIs do we want to access. So what permissions is the user going to grant. And for that, it kind of follows this format. If I want the person's email, it is this, googleapis.com. They'll all begin with this. Then auth userinfo.email. So if they allow permissions, I can then get access to the person's email. If I wanted access to their profile, same format, except in userinfo.profile. So you can have multiple scopes, just separate them by space. They are expected to be one string. And then finally, we are going to OAuth with Google Drive. So these are our scopes. So depending on what your app needs to do, you can add more or less. So let's save that. And let's start now by adding a login button. So let's go to our application template. And just at the top of the page, I'm just going to add a div. I'm not going to do any sort of fancy formatting here. Action, we'll call it authenticate session. And this will be login. Oops. So for this, I am going to need a controller to handle that action. So Ember generate controller application, because this is happening on my application route, but certainly can have the login button live anywhere, most likely a login route. So now let's look at that controller. So there's two things that we need to do here. First, we need to inject the session controller. So Ember Simple Auth uses a service called session, and that is what kind of controls state as to is the person logged in yet? Are they authenticated? It's also kind of like the public API for making requests out to authenticate the user. You'll see the convenience of it, I think, kind of towards the end. But essentially, we want to store some sort of state as to whether the person's actually authenticated, and then we can also store our own state on there, like the user information, if we want to persist that through the app. So let's inject that service. Session. If you know me, I like destructuring a lot. We can do controller inject service equals Ember. So this is that ES6 destructuring, and I like it just because it makes it read a little bit better. And then we have our actions. So actions correspond to, in our template, the action helper authenticate session. So it's going to expect the function in our actions hash called authenticate session. It doesn't take any parameters. But what we're going to do is going to call, so this dot get session. So that's our session service provided by Ember Simple Auth. And we're going to call the authenticate method. So the authenticate method expects two things. One, it expects us to provide a name for our authenticator. And two, it expects the provider name. So again, we're going to use Torii. Torii is going to be our authenticator, and Torii comes with some preset providers for us. So it expects the authenticators to live in the authenticators folder. So let's go ahead and add a new folder called authenticators. Oops. And in this authenticators, we'll add a new file called Torii.js. So the first thing we do is we import the Torii authenticator from Ember Simple Auth, and we extend that. Export default Torii and extend. So Torii also has a service, so we will need to import Ember because we're going to do some Ember stuff in here. Import Ember from Ember. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, const inject service, so just destructuring it so that I don't have to write out ember.inject.service. And it's called Torii. And it comes from the Torii service. So that's something that the Torii add-on does for us. So, like I said, we're going to be calling the authenticate method. So let's write that here, authenticate. And authenticate expects two things. One is the provider. So again, the provider is what we set up here. So google-auth2 is what's going to be passed to this. And then we additionally have options, and I don't think we're going to need that. But these are the two methods that authenticate expects on the Torii authenticator. So coming back here, before we write that function, what we're going to pass is the name of our authenticator, Torii, and google-auth2. So again, that should match this here. So that's what's going to get passed to our authenticate method. So the Torii provider is going to open a pop-up for us. This is what you normally see when you kind of log in through providers like Facebook and Google. Then you're going to go through the OAuth flow in that pop-up, and when it closes, it's going to redirect back to your app, and then we're going to do stuff with that information. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get that Torii service. So this .get Torii, that refers to the Torii service, and that has an open method. Similar to window.open, which would open a small pop-up, but the Torii service it knows how to listen to that window closing and then taking the query parameters from the redirect HTML page and authenticating that, so passing that to our backend. So we're going to call the open method, which takes that provider, which again, Google OAuth, as well as options, which we're not going to pass, but this is what it expects. And this is going to be a promise. But before we get there, we can actually just test this out real quick. Let me just pin this to the bottom here so we have our console up. So if I click login, see, here's that pop-up. I say Scott Tester. Now it's saying, all right, this is what that app is trying to access. Remember, we specified Google Drive in our scope. So I'm going to say, yeah, I'm going to allow that to do that. And then it actually does go through. Close this. But again, we didn't do anything with the promise that resolved. So nothing's happening yet, but that flow did work. So this is a promise that we then will receive an auth response. You can call this whatever you want. Auth response kind of makes sense. And let's take a look at that. Console log auth response. So I save that. We'll come back here. Just refresh it. So log in. Scott Tester. Yes, I want to allow this. And here is the auth response. So if you remember, we're going to take this auth code. We're going to pass it to our backend. Our backend is going to take that auth code and our application's secret, send it back to Google, and Google is going to say, cool, yes, that is in fact right. And it's going to give us that access token. And that access token is what allows us to hit those APIs on behalf of the user. So we have our authorization code. Now we want to make that post request to our API. And just to kind of show you this flow. So this is the Phoenix API. Like I said, you can pull this down from GitHub. But if you want to kind of know the flow that's going through, we have the router. So very similar to the Ember router, this is kind of like the routes that we can hit, we can make requests to. And I created one called auth. So if you go to the localhost 4000/API/auth, see, /API/auth, we are going to create. So create is the same as making a post request. We're going to call the create method on the user controller. So our user controller has this create method. We're doing some pattern matching here. If you're not familiar with this, it's going to, so you know, this is a method, create. It expects the current connection, and then the second parameter, whoops, it expects to be a map with these specific codes. If it doesn't have it, it's going to throw an error back to us. So I'm just creating this. Essentially, these are the params that we're going to send across. Actually, don't need this right here. This is just if I wanted to log things for testing. Plug con query. So it's going to encode this into query params. So these are going to be the query params that we pass along. We're also going to send these headers. Google needs these headers to be present. So if you're writing this yourself using a different API and it's failing, make sure you have these headers specifically set there. And then I just make a post request to this. So this is the token endpoint. And if you read through the Google Docs, it'll kind of break down what this is for. It takes that authorization code that we just got, we post it to the OAuth token endpoint, and then based on that response, so we're going to get a response of 200, we are then going to just send back some JSON to our front end. So we're going to have a promise within a promise on our front end. Hopefully that makes sense. So our back end is where we put that secret. So if we come back here, and where just says secret. So we are going to take this secret and we're just going to paste it right here. So if you're following along, this would be the one thing that you would need to do on the back end. You're going to need your secret here, because again, I'm going to delete this app, so the secret shouldn't actually work for you. So paste that right there. Cool. So again, the flow is we're going to take this auth response and we're going to send the code back to our back end so that it can make that request. So we're going to need to create a new promise. So we can bring in RSVP from Ember to create a new promise. So we're going to return a new RSVP .promise. The function that it expects takes two parameters, resolve and reject. And now, so this is expecting a promise. We're going to write an AJAX request, and we're just going to use Ember's jQuery. But if you want to write the AJAX request using a library like fetch, should be pretty much the same format. So we're going to return an AJAX request, and this is going to go to our backend. http://localhost 4000. That's our local API /auth. It's going to be a type of post. We're making a post request. And the data that we send across, we're going to send that code. So if we come back here, you'll see again it expects the code and the redirect URL. We want to make sure that those two things are present. Otherwise, somebody could try to be spoofing our API. So the code is auth response dot. If we go back to our browser and look in our console, it's this authorization code. And similarly, redirect URI, it does expect it to be snake case. Auth response dot redirect URI, because again, that's coming from here. AJAX has a success callback method, so that'll be our resolve. Error would be reject. Okay, so we have this promise here. Just for posterity's sake, let's log this ourselves. console.log.data. So let's go ahead and refresh this. Scott tester, yes, allow. And we got a 500 error. Oh, that is my mistake, because we also need the client ID to be present as well. So that is my fault. So the client ID actually still needs to match. So that was a different one that I was testing on previously. So the client ID also needs to be present. The secret, again, only lives in the back end. Both the front end and the back end need the client ID. So this could have been something else in addition that we passed through. And to make it easier, I think I'm going to just do that real quick. So let's import environment from config/environment. And we will pass the client ID to be env.torii. What would it be? env.torii.providers.google-auth.api key. Providers google-auth2 .api key. Right, Torii providers google-auth API key. So I'm going to pass that to my backend. So this will be another parameter that we can add here. Client ID equals client ID, and then this I can now just say client ID. So we're going to pass that from our back end, or excuse me, our front end. But just know that we could easily store that here. All right, so let's go through that flow one more time. Sorry about that. Oh, whoops, this should be up a level. Okay, so Scott tester, yes, I want to allow access. Okay, so our backend made that request, we got a 200, and here's that access token that I was talking about. So again, this access token is what needs to be present on every API request that we're going to make out. That is something that we could easily do ourselves. We could take the access token, store it in some sort of session, and then go into our application adapter and adapt it, and add it to the headers. But this is something that, again, Ember Simple Auth has something that can do this for us, and that is called an authorizer. So let's go ahead and just delete this because we don't need this here. This is now doing everything that we need it to. And we're going to create an authorizer. And I need to create another folder. So let's create a folder, authorizers. Make sure I spell that right. And then in here, we're going to create a new file called Google. So this is our Google authorizer. And we're going to import OAuth2 bearer. So bearer token is a common convention you'll see with a lot of OAuth providers. And because of that, Ember Simple Auth gives us some default providers. So Ember Simple Auth authorizers / OAuth2 bearer. Now we just export that default OAuth2 bearer.extend, and this is all that we need to do. We're not going to do anything else with this authorizer, but what this is going to do for us is set that bearer token on every API request going out, and I'll show you how we can do that. So we've got that access token. Now what I want to do is get the user information. So I'm actually going to create a brand new model. Ember generate model user. And we're not going to get overly complicated here, but just to make sure that we have the right thing. Const destructuring this now, model and adder for attributes from DS, so we can delete this, and we can say email. So that's going to be one of the attributes that comes across is a string, and also name. So you can look through the Google documentation if you want, kind of get a breakdown of what other information you can get, but for our purposes we're going to keep it pretty simple. So what we need now is to make a request out to Google with that bearer token to request the user information. So we could write a long AJAX request ourselves manually like we did here, but we want to use Ember data because I want to persist this user record to our store so that I can access it easily. And to do that, we're going to create an adapter. So we're going to Ember generate adapter, and I'm going to create a Google one because I'm going to request multiple things from Google. They're all going to have the same namespace and host. So let's create a default Google adapter, and then we'll extend from it. So the Google adapter is going to be, let me delete this because it's not going to extend from the application. Because the application adapter is a JSON API adapter. The Google adapter is not. It doesn't follow the JSON API format. Remember, it just comes through as a regular hash. It doesn't declare types or anything. It's just a hash with an ID and the attributes. So import DS from Ember data. Not going to bother destructuring here because we only have one thing. So this is going to be a ds.rest adapter. So no longer JSON API format. We're using the REST adapter. And to access that bearer token, that's when we're going to import something from Ember Simple Auth, which is called the data adapter mixin. And this just gets the access token for us. So if you're curious how this works, I dug through the source code. When this comes through, so it gets that promise resolved, it sends back that hash with the access token, and it saves it to the session service. And all this does is just get that access token from the session service and then add the header to the request going out through this adapter. It's really not doing anything that complicated. So if you think there's some magic going on behind the scenes, it's really as simple as I save this token to a service so that I can access it elsewhere. And this mixin, it just writes the boilerplate to create the headers for us on this adapter. You could easily do it yourself if you don't want to use this add-on. But again, it's just kind of convenient. So mixins, and it's called data adapter mixin. So we have to mix this in here, but we have to tell it what authorizer we're using. Because again, we can authorize with multiple providers, but we're going to be authorizing, so authorizer with Google. Authorizer : Google. So we'll know to look in the authorizers folder and fetch the Google one. And our host is https:// google-apis.com. So this is our Google adapter. This is going to be where all of our requests go out by default. So now let's generate an adapter for our user. So if you're unfamiliar with adapters control, think of it this way: adapters are the gatekeepers for requests going out. So for a particular model, it'll tell you where we can hit, so the host name, the path on that host name. So here we have Google APIs, and then like /user info, that would be our host or our path. You can also overwrite how it writes query params and things like that if you want to. We're not going to do anything complicated like that, but just know the adapter is for communication out to some sort of API. So we are going to import our Google adapter that we just created from this file right here. So the same folder, google.js, and then that's what we're extending from, our Google adapter. So the namespace for getting user info is OAuth2 /version2. So we're using the version 2 of the Google OAuth apps. I think you kind of have to now. And then we have path for type. So that is the path under that namespace. So again, it's going to make a request to google-apis.com /OAuth2/v2/userinfo. So again, because this is not, it doesn't follow the JSON API format, that means we actually unfortunately have to add one more additional thing, which is the serializer, because since our application expects everything to be JSON API format, the serializer by default is going to expect it to be JSON API format, so it's going to look at that data that comes across from Google and think it's invalid. So we're going to generate a serializer called user. So again, matches our model name, and we go to a user, serializer user. So in this case, we can just remove the API. It is going to use the JSON serializer. So if you're thinking, why aren't we using the REST serializer? REST serializers expect the resource to come through in a hash named after the model. So we would expect to see something like this, user, and then, you know, email and name, like this. And this is actually going to be so this is what the REST adapt serializer would expect, but what we're actually getting is just this, and that means that it's just a normal JSON serializer. So that's why we're doing that. Okay, so we've set up our model, we've set up our adapter where we're getting our information from, and we're set up our serializer, how we serialize that and save it to the Ember data store. So now let's actually access that information. So let's go back to our controller here. So this authenticate method is actually a promise. So what we can do is we can chain this. So after this promise has happened, we're going to access the Ember data store, and what we're going to call is query record. We're not going to call find record because find record expects us to pass an ID, and that's not what we're going to do because we're just hitting a single endpoint. We're not going to call find all. You might think, all right, well, find all doesn't expect us to pass an ID, but find all will expect the response to be an array, and it's not. We're only going to get a single record back here. So we're going to query record for user. Query record expects query params to be passed to it, but we don't actually have any, so we're just going to send it an empty hash. And then we're going to get a user back. The user is going to be an Ember data model. We can console.log this user. But what I want to do is I want to save it to our session service so that I can access this anywhere. So we're going to access our session service again. So this is where I would write this .get session. I don't want to write it twice because that's just unnecessary overhead. Well, whoops. That session equals this .get session. So now I can write, because again, otherwise it would go through all the overhead of fetching that resource twice. And now we can do session.set current user to be user. And just to be clear, current user isn't something that's set up on the Ember simple auth session service by default. I'm just saving it there. If you want to create your own service called current user, you can certainly do that, but I'm trying to just keep this simple so we don't have a ton of moving parts. But unfortunately with OAuth2, you have a ton of moving parts. So one of the things that the authenticate method does for us by default is it updates whether or not the user was authenticated. So if we want the session service to be injected in all of our routes and controllers by default, we can actually do that in our config environment. In this Torii setup, we can actually say session service name is session. So now our template's going to have access to this session. Otherwise, we would inject it into like our index controller or our application controller, and then it would have access to it. We're already injecting it into this application, so we don't actually need to do this, but it is just kind of convenient so you don't have to repeat yourself so much. We might need to restart our app since we're playing around with the config environment, so I'll restart it and go Ember.js. And now let's look at that template for our application. Since we have access to that session service, we can do if session.isAuthenticated. Let's maybe add this big H1 here that says, hey there, session.current user, so that's that property that we set up ourselves, .name. So let's go ahead and refresh this. We're going to log in. I think we lost it somehow. Okay, sorry about that. So apparently the error I was running into is I somehow spelled success incorrectly here, and that's why it was failing. So success, make sure you spell everything correctly. Don't be like me and just hit random keys. So sorry about that, but now if we go in, and again, just to show what we're doing, so if session is authenticated, then show the session's current user .name. So if I log in here, hey there, Scott Tester. So that is the name of my fake account. So we took that user record, you see we're logging it here, and saved it to our session service so we can access it anywhere in our application, and we just put it there on the template. So we made an OAuth request to Google. We got the token, the access token back. We send that access token with the client secret to our backend, and that gave us our access token, which we then send across with every single request. So if you look here, and if we look at the header, we should see authorization bearer, and here's that long token that we sent across. Cool. So how do we access other resources? So in this case now we want to access stuff on somebody's Google Drive. And I should probably add stuff to my Google Drive. Okay, so I just saved some test stuff to my, my Google Drive there. So I want to now create a new model called drive file. It can be called whatever you want, but drive file kind of makes sense to me. So Ember generate model drive file. And we're also going to Ember generate an adapter for drive file as well. And much like user, we're going to generate a serializer. Because again, we're communicating out with a different API than our normal backend, the Phoenix one that we're hosting here. Model drive file. So we're going to destructure just like we were before, const ds model adder equals ds. So we don't have to write ds there. The drive API, I just know this from reading the documentation, has a kind, which refers to whether it's a doc or a spreadsheet, as a created date. Created date, which is a date, has a title, obviously, which is a string. We also have a last modifying username, so that'll tell me the person who modified it. We also have an object called last modifying user, so we'll just do an empty attribute because that's an object that we can break down. And we also have an icon link, which is that little image that indicates whether it's a sheet or a PDF or a doc, and that'll be a string. So let's next go to our adapter. Much like the user file, we're going to create the Google adapter from Google. The namespace for this, however, is going to be drive/v2. So it's not going to be OAuth2 like the user one was. And the path for type here, we're going to return is just called files. So I'm going to create a new route called drive. So let's do Ember generate route drive, and this is where we're going to have a model hook that calls out to the Google API and fetches all of our drive files. So let's go to the route for that. And we're going to have a model hook here. And this is we're going to call, we're going to return this .store. So the Ember data store, find all drive file. Simple as that. And next we want to go to that, just delete some of these. We want to go to our serializer for a drive file. And the reason I want to do this is because the drive files actually come through very differently than the user information. So we're going to use the REST serializer. And just to kind of inspect this, let's normalize array response. So if you watched my Ember data tutorial, you'll know normalize array response is the function that gets called when we're using the find all method. So when we're requesting multiple records instead of a single record. Accepts a few parameters: the store, the primary model class, so the name of the model, and then the payload. Also expects an ID and a request type. Payload is going to be the only thing that we're paying attention to here. So console.log, we're going to log the payload that comes across, just so we can kind of see how exactly this is broken down. And then we'll just call this .super.arguments. So on our, let's go to our template application. If the user is authenticated, we're also going to add a link to that drive route. Because again, we only want people to be able to access the drive route if they're authenticated. So now if they're authenticated, we can go to the drive route. Oh. So my bad for the typo there. So to refresh this, we'll log in again. And here, if we come here, we're actually going to get an error. And this is one of the things that I like about the Google API. So I did not, in the developer tools, set up my app to query for Google Drive info. But luckily, the error response gives me the exact URL I need to use to grant that permission. So if we come here, I'm going to enable this API library on my app. So Google is very, very careful to make sure that you can only get access to certain things. So this is nice because if people did get your app information, they couldn't just start writing all these requests to a bunch of different APIs. So let's refresh our app now that we've granted that access, because Google told us exactly what we needed to do. We're going to log in. Then we're going to go to this drive. And it made the request. And here is the breakdown. So it has an E tag, it has incomplete search, a bunch of other stuff, but the actual files themselves are saved in this items array. And this is actually what we want for our payload. So what we can do is we can, in that normalized array response, we can just take the items array and send that to the Ember data store, and Ember will take care of the rest for us. So in this serializer, what I did was I just let response equals drive files. This is what it would expect, how it would expect the data to come across. Payload dot items. Then in here, we would just have all of this again, except payload would now be a response. So let's come back here now. And let's go to, sorry, before I go too much further, let's go to the template here. And I'm just going to paste this in. But really just to show for each model, so for each drive file as document, we're just going to list the document title, we're going to list who it was modified by last, and we're going to show the little image for what type of file it is. So now if I log in, I logged in, hey there, Scott Tester, and if I go to the drive directory, I now can see here's my untitled spreadsheet, test123, and my getting started PDF. I believe this also could have just been a JSON serializer. If we just changed it to that, would that have still worked? Yes, it would have. So that didn't need to be a REST serializer. I'm not sure why I thought it did. JSON serializer works just fine. Just again, we don't want all the superfluous information that comes with it. We just want the items. So one last thing to note here is Ember Simple Auth has what's called authenticated route mixins. So if we go to Ember Simple Auth's documentation repo here, let's look at their mixins, and we want to get their authenticated route mixin. So we're going to import this Ember authenticated route mixin, and what this means is authenticated route from this. And if we mix this into certain routes, this tells our application that the user cannot access this unless they have been authenticated. But in order for this to work, it wants to find what it calls the authentication route. And that is something that we can set up in our config environment. So similar to Torii, we can set up options for Ember Simple Auth. And that's going to be an attribute here that is called, I believe it's authentication route. For us, it's just going to be our index route. And you'll see if I try to directly access now a route that uses that authenticated route mixin, it's going to redirect me to whatever route I specify here. And so that's super handy if you have an app that does need to live behind authentication. You just add that mixin to all those routes that a user can't access unless they're logged in. So log in. Now that I'm logged in, I can access the drive route, and here's all the stuff that I got from Google Drive. So that's kind of authentication in a nutshell. I know a few people have asked for examples of authentication, so finally got around to it. Hopefully it wasn't too much. OAuth2 can seem super daunting at first, but the more you play with it, the more you realize it's more just tedious than anything. It's not really hard. Create an app through the Google Dev Tools that gives you that client ID or API key is what we called it, as well as the client secret. So your front end makes a request to Google with that client ID. That sends back an authorization response. We send that response to our backend. Our backend takes that response and makes another request to Google with the secret, our client secret. Google then authenticates us and says, yes, here is your access token. We then take that access token and we add it to every single request that goes out to Google so that we can make requests on its behalf. One thing you'll notice here is if I refresh, I'm automatically logged out. So maintaining this session upon page reload is something, there's lots of different ways to do it. Typically, you would have your backend drop a cookie and save that authentication response so that you don't have to make the person keep logging in. Maybe you use local storage. Maybe you take that user information, so the person's email and stuff, and you persist it to your backend. That's up to you how you want to store that information and how you want to save it. This tutorial was really more just to go over the OAuth flow and how we can make requests. So yeah, whatever strategy you want to take to kind of persist that information is up to you. So I am going to push all this code up to the repos that I have linked in the description. They're going to be on the Google OAuth branch. So feel free to pull this down, follow along. or just play around with it. Again, don't try to copy the API keys that I have there, because I'm going to delete them. So hopefully this was useful. If you have any questions, just leave stuff in the comments. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Thanks so much.